And Brian Stevenson joining us now from New York. Thanks for being with us on the program. I want to start by asking you personally, as a civil rights attorney, as an American, what was going through your mind watching the pictures over the weekend, these ugly truths being pushed front and centre, and a president who initially at least did not condemn those who brought the hate?
Well, it just reminded me of how much work we have to do in this country to confront our history of racial inequality. I mean, I think we've been indifferent. We've been silent for a very long time about this history. We haven't confronted it. We are a post-genocide society. We had Native people here who were slaughtered by the millions, and we didn't deal honestly with that. We said that they were a different race. We're a post-slavery society where we tolerated 2 centuries of enslavement. And I don't think the great evil of slavery was involuntary servitude, but it was this narrative that black people are different than white people. They're not as good. They're not as fully developed. And that ideology of white supremacy shaped our history. And then we, of course, had decades of terrorism and lynching and violence, and then segregation and racial hierarchy. And all of that was constructed on an idea that these monuments represent, that they reinforce. And so seeing people fighting to preserve that, pushing for the sustaining of that is deeply disheartening, but I do think it reflects our failure as a society to commit to telling the truth about our history.
And you are here, of course, to support and exhibit the legacy of lynching, confronting racial terror in America. And you were quoted as saying, and I just want to read this, the exhibit is a prelude to a larger effort to change the landscape of the United States, which is largely silent about our history of racial terror and lynching. Speak to that. Why has there been that silence, and how does it play into what we saw in Charlottesville?
Well, you know, as I said, I do think that, you know, the North may have won the military war during the 19th century, but the South won the narrative war. They were allowed to sustain this belief that the effort to preserve slavery was noble, that the architects of slavery were great people, and that romanticizing of our history created a real cost. We put up these markers, these monuments, these icons to celebrate an era of white supremacy, and that led to violence and terror. We had decades of lynching, and then segregation and Jim Crow and this codified racial hierarchy, and we really haven't had the capacity. When you're dealing with enslavement and you're trying to get free, you have to focus on slavery. When you're dealing with lynching and you're trying to stop the violence, you focus on lynching. When you're dealing with segregation and codified racial hierarchy, you deal with that. And we're just getting to the point where we can start talking honestly about how we have to change the cultural landscape. I live in Alabama, where there are hundreds of memorials and monuments dedicated to the Confederacy. In my state, we celebrate Confederate Memorial Day as a state holiday. Jefferson Davis's birthday is a state holiday. We don't even have Martin Luther King Day. We have Martin Luther King / Robert E. Lee Day. And I think that history creates the kinds of conflict and tension that you saw on display, but it also creates an America that's not really free, that hasn't dealt honestly. And
this monument in particular is one, as you point out, that celebrates a man that actually formed an army to go fight to protect, if you like, slavery. Donald Trump often spoke of radical Islamic terrorism, criticizing others for not using those words, and yet he wouldn't come out until today and name white nationalists, neo-Nazis, and so on. Is it, in your view, too late now that no matter what he says, he's not going to avoid the impression that, as many have said, his equivocation gave those white supremacists the sense, at least, they had his support?
Well, I don't think there's any question that the president's reaction has been incredibly disappointing and has undermined the kind of leadership that we need to see in response to racial bigotry, to extremism represented by white nationalists, by the KKK and all of these other groups. And in fact, I actually think the president using the rhetoric of law and order doesn't help very much either. I mean, we can prosecute the young man who drove his car into that crowd, and we can hold him accountable. But there's a bigger problem. We can't solve the problem of an emerging nationalism in this country, of this resurgence of racist violence, by simply prosecuting that person. We've got to speak honestly about the unacceptability of that perspective, of that bigotry, of that hatred.
Talk more about that resurgence, because there has always been that undercurrent, if you like. And in recent years, I think, you know, it's fair to say that a lot of that sentiment was kept under a rock. There is an argument that Donald Trump's position or often his non-position on white nationalists has given permission to that element of society to come out, the feeling that they have validation, and to them at least, that they had a supporter, or at least a non-critic in the White House. Is that something you subscribe to, that theory?
Well, I mean, when David Duke and other leaders of that movement are giving voice to that sentiment, then I think you have to credit it. I mean, they're saying that his candidacy and his election has empowered their perspective and their viewpoints. There were a lot of people who've been very critical of some of his appointments because they have been aligned with some of these perspectives. So I don't think there's any question that we're at a moment when there is this resurgence, where there is this view that these views are somehow more tolerable, they're more acceptable, they're more mainstream than they have been for some period of time. But I just think it's a continuum. We can't focus on just the extremism. We've got a lot of people in this country that have been very hesitant to talk about racial bias, to talk about the continuing challenges we face in this country with regard to racial equality. And you see it in immigration, you see it in a whole host of issues.
Absolutely. And one of those things that was striking, I think, to a lot of people in Charlottesville, the gathering there, was how young a lot of these men were. Why is that? What is the appeal? Why is their view of history at such odds with the reality when it comes to things like racial superiority, neo-Nazism, and the like? Why are the young being attracted to this?
Well, no one is born hating another person because of their color. You have to be taught that. And I think we haven't done a good job of disrupting that kind of teaching. And I think the real problem with these Confederate monuments and memorials is that they endorse, they accommodate a certain worldview that is very racialized, where white supremacy isn't seen as some great evil. And we've just failed as a nation to be honest about our history. In South Africa, you can't spend time there without confronting the legacy of apartheid.
Yeah.
In Rwanda, they will make you hear about the difficulty of the genocide. If you go to Germany, you can't go 100 meters without markers and icons appearing that mark the spaces where Jewish families were abducted. There's a Holocaust memorial. We talk honestly about that legacy, but we don't talk about slavery in America. We don't talk about lynching. We don't talk about segregation, and it allows this kind of horrific, misguided bigotry to be born and nurtured and to manifest itself even in very young people.
Brian Stevenson, founder and executive director, Equal Justice Initiative. Thank you so much.
Glad to be with you.